representative of the OIC private sector, ICCIA is working to build the knowledge of its beneficiaries by bringing programs, activities, and content that serve to grow the private sector in general and the intra-OIC trade more specifically. Hence, the series of webinars aims to highlight the available financial and technical resources which are being offered by international organizations such as the UN agencies, OIC organs, and development funds. The theme for the second session today is on green financing. And as you may know, in recent years, the discourse on green financing has gained significant traction with global events like COP27 and the World Economic Forum. And these platforms have highlighted the urgent need to accelerate investments in sustainable projects and transition towards a greener and more resilient economy. According to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is UNFCCC, the one missing link between knowing and doing things in the transition to green industry is green finance. And as we know, green finance is any structured financial activity that's been created to ensure a better environmental outcome. During COP27, governments made substantial headway on adaptation, and as per the UNFCCC, they reached an agreement on the global goal on adaptation and pledged over USD 230 million to the adaptation fund. In light of the prevailing circumstances and the discourse and the conversations, development organizations have a pivotal role in addressing the challenges to advocacy, investments, funding opportunities, and capacity building. Based on this, our webinar today will address the role, challenges, opportunities, and policy recommendations associated with green financing. Now, let's introduce our esteemed panelists. First, we have Ms. Sobha, Chief of Financing for Development Section, Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development Division from the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia Pacific, UNESCAP. Thank you, Ms. Sobha, for joining us today. UNESCAP has been actively engaged in promoting green financing practices to drive sustainable development across the Asia Pacific region. Next, we have Dr. Rafifa, who's a Senior Environmental Specialist at the International Finance Corporation, IFC. Thank you, Dr. Rafifa, for joining us today. IFC, a member of the World Bank Group, has been a leading force in mobilizing private sector investments for sustainable projects worldwide and promoting the adoption of green financing approaches. Lastly, Mr. Yusuf, who was supposed to participate from ISDB, could not join due to his health condition, and we wish him a speedy recovery. Realizing the significant role of advocacy in green financing, and as we know, advocacy efforts play a crucial role in raising awareness and mobilizing support. In this light, I would like to direct my question to Ms. Sobha. Ms. Sobha, as an expert in this field, how does UNESCAP leverage advocacy to mobilize green financing and drive sustainable development? And what are some of UNESCAP's initiatives in the field of green financing?
Thank you, Safina, and thanks so much for inviting me today with the Islamic Chamber of Commerce, Industry and Agriculture. We're very honored to be here. I have just like a brief presentation that I'll just share quickly. It's only 5 minutes that explains exactly what you have outlined here. So let me just share that quickly and then we can get started. So as you said, what does ESCAP do in terms of the role of advocacy? And you've already described the division and the section that I come from. But for those who may not know, ESCAP is the regional arm of the United Nations Secretariat. We cover 53 member states across Asia and the Pacific. And we provide a forum for government to think and review and discuss economic and social issues, much of which is around climate finance, given what you've described as the outcomes of COP, both on the climate front, but also increasingly on the nature front as well for finance. We act as a think tank and we publish research, and I'll do a little bit more on that later. Regional cooperation, research analysis, and technical assistance. And that's, again, if we were to put it into 3 pillars, it would be consensus building among member states on key issues around climate finance, research analysis, and technical assistance. For example, we've been helping governments across Asia Pacific, such as Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and Bhutan, on green finance frameworks, green bond frameworks, some of them on debt for nature swaps, etc. So when we think about advocacy to the green or sustainable finance ecosystem, we think sometimes this is, I mean, not that anyone thinks it's easy, but we think sometimes that there are specific actors, that they're all intergovernmental, that we can all go to COP and we can, just argue sort of the main negotiation points around commitments, around, around change. But what I think we need to take a step back and realize is that the green and sustainable finance ecosystem is immense. On the regulatory and policy side, it covers financial regulators, ministries, stock exchanges, standards initiative, rating agencies, etc. Just on the financial sector, it covers not only central banks, but the actual banks themselves, pension funds, insurance companies, and it covers a range of instruments around debt, equity, and assets. And then, of course, where does it all come down to? What we call the coal face. It's in the real economy. Unless businesses, for example, switch to alternative forms of energy, unless there's finance to phase out coal in the region, unless there's finance for new technologies like green hydrogen, the green finance trajectory is not going to move forward fast enough. So we have a report coming out, and what I'm going to do is run through, it comes out in September, and what I'm going to do is run through the 10 action points on advocacy as well as other actions we have for our member states. The first one is that we really need to rethink climate finance partnerships. This is a new area. It involves scientific targets. It involves carbon targets in many cases, involves the phasing out of coal and fossil fuels, etc. It's not going to be done just by investing in in renewable energy. It involves a lot of change across current industries, and that requires new partnerships to rethink this, such as the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. For countries, even though all countries, with the exception of 2, I think globally, have made commitments at COP, what are called the nationally determined contributions, financing strategies are still missing for many of them. Clear strategies with interim targets, not just deferring a target until 2050 or 60, but saying, okay, we're going to do this in 2030 and 2040. It's going to require this much actions, this many actions in these sectors, so sector pathways, along with financing around public and private sources are needed. And the ministries leading such financing strategies really need to have clear mandates so they can drive this change. Policy coordination, coherence, obviously, across not just finance and government, but across energy, transport, and environment. And this is quite new. I mean, these are not necessarily ministries that are used to working with each other, but for green and climate finance to move ahead, that needs to happen. Regulatory signals from regulators, financial regulators, regarding the importance of incorporating climate risk into banking scenarios, introducing green objectives, incentivizing green financing. And we have a few leaders in Asia and Pacific, but overall, this is, I think, where the rubber really needs to hit the road. And then, of course, for this part is the investment in the capacities of financial personnel on how do we even assess climate risk? Where do we get the data? How do we supervise the transition path of the green economy? When we know that there are tipping points, but we don't exactly know when we're going to reach those tipping points. And on private finance, what we mean by banks, issuers, and investors across the region, more is required in Asia Pacific. More Asian Pacific banks need to commit to net zero pledges, and they need to build in interim targets, including before 2030, while we wait, obviously, for 2050 or 2060. Project preparation in the region also needs to change. The traditional models of waiting for, kind of package deals to come to you without being involved in the inception, without building these deals, and moving away from a deal-by-deal approach to a platform approach, that also needs to change. And obviously, local currency investment into green projects need to change as well. And finally, with donors and the DFIs, what we believe is that obviously this preparation needs to be supported in smaller ticket green projects. While the multilateral climate funds such as GCF and others have money for very large projects, there are obviously challenges faced by many in accessing these. And often smaller ticket projects are overlooked, and they need to be looked at because they graduate to larger ticket projects later. And finally, obviously, is the large discussion, very intense discussion this year we're seeing on concessional financing and the role of MDBs and their ability to take on more risk and leverage private sector financing to come into action around climate action. So that's, in full, really the work of what we're doing in ESCAP. And another division of ours is also supporting through the ESCAP Sustainable Business Network, also supporting the Asia Pacific Green Deal for business, and many of their actions here, which they put forward in their declaration, are advancing a zero carbon energy system, looking at cities, infrastructure and mobility, mobilizing obviously public and private finance, and moving towards a circular economy. So with that, let me stop, and I hope I haven't gone over time. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Subha, for sharing the initiatives in US of UNESCAP and the 10-point roadmap. And as rightly pointed out, financing is just not enough. Advocacy indeed is something we need, and it encourages financial institutions, governments, and stakeholders integrate environmental considerations into their decision-making processes. So thank you so much. Now moving on to Ms. Afifa. So recognizing the crucial role of the private sector adaptation in driving sustainable development, it is imperative to foster an environment that supports businesses in their transition towards green practices. And as we've seen significant movements, such as the Alliance of the CEO Climate Leaders, which is a coalition created by the World Economic Forum, comprising over 120 plus chief executive officers who believe that the private sector has a responsibility to get involved in cutting greenhouse gas emissions. Now, to shed light on the available support for the private sector, I would like to direct my question to Dr. Afifa. Dr. Afifa, what initiatives and program has IFC undertaken to encourage and support the private sector in adapting to sustainable practices through green financing? Over to you.
Thanks, Safina. Thanks for having me over for this session. Just a couple of slides to start with, so I'll be sharing my screen. Let me know if you can see it.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so first and foremost, IFC, as you all know, is a member of the World Bank Group, and we provide investments. So we directly invest in banks, advice and resource mobilization. We are a AAA credit rating entity and owned by 184 member countries. We operate presently in nearly 100 countries, so great local presence. So World Bank has a couple of arms: IBRD, IDA, IFC, NIGA, and ICVIT, out of which IFC provides solutions in the private sector development. So when we invest in private sector, we not only provide advice and investment, but we also bring in our value addition and our global expertise into these companies, with a key focus on greening the economy. So we have a climate change action plan, and within that action plan, climate finance is a key area where we are focusing. We plan to be 100% Paris aligned from July 2025. We have already started, and we have reached a great target already. 35% average own account business over FY21 to FY25, and mobilizing and catalyzing private capital over FY21 to 25. So clear climate objectives, and this is where we have a lot of focus on. Going forward, the focus is only going to deepen. So World Bank, if we look at the World Bank goal, aligned to that is IFC's core climate business, and we focus on clean energy, climate smart cities, green buildings, green finance, and climate smart agribusiness. While these have been some traditional areas, we are seeing increasingly climate investments in transport and water, and also cuts across all of these is disruptive technologies. So these are our core pillars of work, but today I'm going to talk about green finance only. So some of the milestones that we have already achieved. So we issued our first green bond in 2010. We mobilize investors, and we are great at setting standards. Some of our standards you might be quite familiar with. IFC performance standards are adopted by many private sector companies. And since 2005, IFC has worked with over 190 financial institutions in 65 countries. Our approach is a bit different from others in the sense that since we are investors in financial institutions, we not only look at their opportunities for financing, but we also work on the challenges because we become part of the bank. So our understanding of financial institutions, we operate from a different level. So some of the key areas where we work, definitely green loans. We have been doing that for many years, but now we are increasing in volumes. Capital market development, creating green bond markets and climate bonds, launching targeted debt funds and offering structured products like green MBS. Green buildings, we have a lot of initiatives in this space. We are coming up with new products and opportunities in green transport, climate smart agriculture, blue finance. Greening financial sector, we have a flagship program called 30 by 30 program, and of course the Sustainable Banking Network, which is a network of financial regulators to come together and discuss green finance. Thought leadership, we have our Green Banking Academy and Green Commercial Bank Alliance. IFC also has a tool called Climate Assessment for Financial Institutions, the CAFI tool, which is used by bankers. And of course, distributed solar, providing energy access and lighting solutions. So there is a huge opportunity or a potential we see in green finance in South Asia. At least there is 2,234 billion. And if you break them by sectors, there is opportunities in buildings, transport, renewable, electric transmission, industrial energy efficiency waste. These figures are not only figures, but these are our guiding principles because we now know where the opportunities are, and this is where we want to strike. So in order for us to do these, we have credit lines, we have certain risk sharing products and partial guarantees because these are new areas. There is mezzanine financing and subordinated debt, there is trade guarantees. And of course, we have our advisory services. So market development analysis and product development, green transformation, capacity building, climate risk assessment, reporting as per TCFD tools and resources. So our advisory work also goes hand in hand with our investment. Let's skip this slide. So today, these are my slide deck, but today I wanted to focus a bit on a project that we have recently completed. And I think there might be a bit of interest in that. So our, I'll stop sharing. So we have a project in Pakistan called the ESRM Pakistan project. We just completed it on June 30th. The thing we did with this program is we worked with the Pakistan Central Bank in developing environmental and social risk management guidelines for the entire financial sector. So SBP issued the green banking guidelines in 2017. This comes as a complementary support for bankers to do environmental and social due diligence, which also includes climate risk assessment while lending. So if they are going to lend to private sector, they will have to ensure that environmental and social risks are adequately managed before they lend out the money. This has been rolled out as a voluntary requirement for the entire financial sector, which will be turned into a policy in the next 3 years' time. So banks have also started implementing, but the key focus of this is the reporting element of it. The guideline requires all banks to report on their sustainability parameters to central bank every quarter, which looks at 4 types of parameters. One is environmental and social risk in lending. The second is green financing. The third is reducing the bank's own carbon footprint. And the fourth one is CSR activities related to environment. So when the banks report on these parameters, it would be very difficult for banks to send empty reports to central bank every quarter. So it is sort of pushing the banks towards adopting these policies and procedures. Apart from that, this guideline also gives the tools that are required for doing due diligence. So it comes up with separate tools for SME, separate tools for project finance. Those are inbuilt into the implementation manual. It also provides clear indication as to within a bank who does what. So what is required from the board of directors to what it would be required from a frontline relationship managers, or all are articulated in this guideline. So this has a positive impact, I think, on the entire economy, because all the financial institutions, not only IFC investee clients, but any bank, any small bank, would have to adopt certain policies and procedures towards greening their lending activity. So this project has a follow-up project which is coming up, and which will also look at green finance and will also work with businesses in greening the economy. So I'll stop here, but happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Rafifa, for sharing the initiatives of IFC, especially how IFC is contributing to green bonds and how some practical steps are being taken to transform financial institutions top down. It's great to hear. So in recent years, and the global economy has faced a multitude of overlapping crises and challenges, and they're ranging from geopolitical issues to COVID-19, food security concerns, and thus there's an urgent need to address climate change. And as highlighted in discussions at forums like the OPEC Fund Development Forum, which was held quite recently, and the G20 Summit, it's been estimated that the annual investment required to meet global climate goals by 2050 is approximately 110 trillion USD. And however, the current investment levels fall significantly short of this target, and this is one of the challenges amongst many. Taking these factors into consideration, my question to both of you is that in the context of green financing for sustainable development, what are some of the challenges to mobilize green financing, and how member states, private sector, and development organizations such as yourselves are taking measures to overcome it? Okay, I'm happy to see that Mr. Yusuf has also joined us. So anybody who would like to take this question, please, the floor is yours.
Maybe we can let Mr. Yusuf start, as I think we've spoken, and I'm happy to add in after that.
Yeah.
Okay. So Mr. Yusuf, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Safina. My sincere apologies that I had to send in an email earlier this morning. I guess I caught the flu while I was traveling on a business trip over the weekend, and I think it's a very severe one. So that's why I had to send an email, just to in the event that I won't be able to join the conversation. So as a matter of introduction, so my name is Olatunji Yusuf. So I work at the Islamic Development Bank with the headquarters here in Saudi Arabia. I work within the climate change global practice. And just to give also a very short overview, very similar to what colleagues from the two institutions on the call they've also given, is around the fact that the Islamic Development Bank actually operates in 57 countries across 4 continents. And in recent time, one of the key areas that we've actually focused our intervention, particularly looking at our realigned strategy, the focus is specifically on driving green economic growth, which is whether it's in the transport sector, in energy sector, whether it's in agriculture, securities, around towards helping our clients, our member countries, to actually drive effort towards green economic growth. And one important thing one important thing that is important to emphasize is that as a bank, being a bank from the global south, we are actually the largest multilateral development bank from the global south that is owned by countries in the global south and not countries in the global north, meaning that for everything that I talk about, I represent the constituency of ownership from the predominantly the global south. It's something that is quite ambitious to see that a global south institution is talking about driving green economic growth. But considering that this is something that is also at the heart of what our clients they actually face today, it makes a lot of sense for us to be able to also align ourselves to that. Very similar to what colleagues have also mentioned is the fact that as a bank, we have a very ambitious climate finance target of 35% by 2025. In fact, in the last 2 years, about 31 to 33% of our total financing have been geared towards climate action across the continent where we actually work. And as colleagues from IFC also said, we also belong to the same group of multilateral development bank, also having the same commitment towards Paris alignment. Is that by the end of this year, the bank is going to have all of our investment contributing to fully Paris aligned by the end of this year. So this is something that is actually quite ambitious, and how this translates to driving green investment is the fact that when you have the bulk of your investment being committed to be aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement, so the likelihood of having those more green financing provided by our institutions is actually much higher. But of course, as colleagues have actually mentioned, I think there are numerous challenges. The financings are not enough. The capacity is inadequate. All from the background that has been provided by UNSCAP to the points that colleagues from IFC, I think these are common issues that we all have in our respective institutions, and we're all making efforts in our own different ways to see how we can actually provide them. With IFC specifically focused on private sector, I'm from the public side with a lot of focus on the sovereign side of financing. I think in the end is about how do we all work together, collaborate together to be able to actually address some of these very complex issues that we face in our member countries. So in the last couple of years, we're beginning to see a whole lot of effort beyond just the capacity building element, but also having to see how we can actually support institutions that are closer to the ground, particularly financial intermediaries. In our case, Islamic finance institutions. How do we equip them in a way and manner with the tools and the versatility that is needed to be able to address many of these complex development issues? And we've been able to put quite a number of programs to be able to do that. One of the things that I would like to emphasize here is around the challenge that we've often faced as a development bank is around the fact that you hear financiers will always say the financing is there, but the projects are not there. So why is it so? Why is that disconnect between there's a lot of green financing out there, right? Of course, there are also the risk of greenwashing elements, but then we do agree that whether it's from the capital market, whether it's through bonds or sukuk, the money is there. But the challenge has always been the eligible projects are often not there. Why is that the case? Why is that the challenge? I work with our treasury colleague in our green sukuk and sustainable finance that we actually issue. The challenge that has often come is around having those lists of eligible bankable projects, because when we talk about green financing, it's not the normal type of financing. It's not normal. So there are certain elements, there are certain criteria that is needed to be met. There are certain standards that are needed to be complied with, right? So why is that? Is that disconnect between what we get from the level of whether it's from the private sector or from the countries and what the global standards, what they're talking about? Those are big challenges that we continue to face. And one of the areas in which the bank, we have continued to do that is around how do we enhance capacity at the level of whether it's the ministry, particularly from the public side, how do we work with different partners, UN agencies, non-governmental organizations, to see how we can increase the level of capacity of our clients to be able to develop those bankable type of investment. Because when we talk about bankability, there are different elements. There is the economic element, there is the climate-related element, and there is the financial side of things. So it's all about how do we bring those together to be able to ensure that those elements. I'm going to stop there so that I can give the floor back to our colleagues. But this is in a nutshell what the bank does and the different ways in which our work complements the work of the other colleagues that were on this call together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing, Mr. Yusuf. So over to you, Ms. Soba.
Thank you. I mean, I think, Mr. Yusuf and Dr. Afifa have spoken about many of the same things that I think development banks in particular are looking at. I mean, I would just like to make it maybe a little bit of more of a provocative point on the fact that in order to meet the carbon goals, where I think the latest IPCC report shows that we will deplete the carbon budget in 6 to 7 years. So that means we don't have actually a lot of time for financing to go towards reducing emissions. And emissions, of course, big emission reductions are really going to come from fossil fuels and coal, especially in Asia Pacific. So while the focus on, I think, finding projects, investing through green financial instruments into new green buildings, new renewable energy, which is the bulk of where financing currently, private financing is going, is important, and more of that needs to be done. There also needs to be a focus on how we can redirect financing to, compensate the early phase out of coal, fossil fuels, etc. And that's, maybe a point that I'd like to add.
Dr. Afifa, would you like to contribute?
Sure. I'll just talk a little bit about challenges that the banks face, because we work very closely with them. When you ask the banks that, do you have any green finance portfolio? They would say, no, we are thinking about it. This is a new thing, we haven't started. But if you ask them that, do you have any instances where you have changed the boiler of the companies from fossil fuel to gas boilers? Yeah, many. Have you ever done modernization in factories, big scale? Yes, massive modernization, including LED lights, this, that they have changed. If you ask them, what is your green finance portfolio? It's zero, but they are doing this day in, day out already. So having an MIS system which captures green finance related data is a very good starting point, and many banks don't have it. The other thing is internal process. We now have, thanks to media, thanks to so much discussion about green finance, climate finance that's happening, we have knowledgeable bankers, but we don't have banks that have process to factor in that knowledge, the things that they personally know about climate finance, how to go about it, what sort of things that they can finance, etc., etc. So the banks needs to have their internal processes developed if they want to do green finance. The other thing about green finance is the challenges that banks face is that there are multiple stakeholders involved. So there will be an energy auditor who does energy audit. This audit report is very important because it gives bankers the comfort that, yes, if they go for energy efficiency, this much of energy saving would accrue that much of climate carbon emission reduction, GHG gas emission reduction, etc. So the coordination between the technology service provider, the consultant who would be doing climate energy efficiency audits, and bringing the financing on board, this requires coordination with multiple players. Banks feel baffled by that. They just want to deal with the client and just go ahead and finance. Green finance is not going to be that easy because there are certain skills which the banks don't have, and they'll have to outsource that or get it from outside. So this becomes a big challenge for the banks. The other thing is messaging. Very few banks I've seen actually have launched a product that and provides clean messaging to the market that we are a bank that does green finance. So until and unless you are saying to the market that you actually understand this product, you have a product offering for people who are interested in this sort of thing, people would be going to banks and taking money for their overhead or as an equity or but it will not be labeled as green finance until and unless banks come out and actually say that we are doing this, we understand this, we have people who can process this. So there is a bit of problem there. Internal barriers also exist within the bank. So there is a risk team that looks at environmental and social issues, risks that are there in a client's premises. So for example, a client is polluting the river and they need an effluent treatment plant, but they don't go and speak to the business team who are struggling to find a client where they can finance a green product. So the risk team is sitting on bulk of information where they have already identified what the client needs, but this information is not going to the opportunity team that easily. These two teams are not speaking. So all in all, green finance becomes a very challenging proposition for the bank and also for the bankers. Until and unless they start doing it in a very structured manner with the right procedures in place, people trained properly, it would become very difficult for them to do it in bulk. They might be doing in bits and pieces, but going for really big elements of green finance might be very difficult for especially local banks. I'll stop here. Happy to take questions.
Thank you. Those were some interesting insights and challenges shared by all the speakers. And building on the challenges discussed, recently, we've also witnessed a shift in the conversations and the discourse around green financing. A report of the World Economic Forum, which was published recently, states that the leaders of the world's rich economies have now sort of agreed to provide 100 billion USD in climate finance to developing countries. And this new agreement particularly includes a commitment to provide more accountability and transparency for climate finance. And this poses some opportunities both for the developing world as well as the developed world. My question to all the panelists is that with the Sustainable Development Goals set to conclude in 2030, what do you envision as the next steps in advancing green financing? And what are the key drivers that you believe will play a pivotal role in unlocking green finance in the next decade? Any one of you who would like to take the floor for this?
So thank you so much.
Please.
Thank you so much. I think that's a very good question. I think one of the challenges that and the question that we'll continue to grapple with is around what pushed the Sustainable Development Goals in 2030. What next, right? How do we get to that world that we want to get to, where that low carbon, climate resilient future? Because when we talk about green, often people just talk about green from the perspective of the low carbon. No, green it goes beyond just low carbon. So it also includes building resilience of system against critical climate risk, flood, wildfire, those different climate related risks. So it's an embodiment of a whole lot of it. One is around the fact that now we're beginning to see that countries are having those policies. What would anticipate that would have post 2030 is that we'll have much more ambitious policies, right? Policies that are not just for the sake of having them, but then that are able to translate into meaningful transformation that the world actually needs. So those sort of policies are actually what the world actually needs post 2030. The other thing is around the regulatory environment. I think one of the key challenges that we continue to face today is that exactly the inconsistency, particularly in some jurisdictions, particularly around government policies, can be a major impediment for the scale up of green finance. We have seen this in many countries. In some countries, it's much easier for the government to continue to provide subsidy for fossil fuel than it is to give subsidy for renewables. So these are issues. These are political issues that we don't have that conversation enough, but they are major challenges that we have in many countries, that even though the ambition is there, even though the plan is there, but you can't see that ambition being translated to action of the government of the different jurisdictions that we actually work. So that alone in itself, it's a challenge. Of course, as colleagues from IFC rightly mentioned, I think coordination is needed. Coordination is needed within country and from external stakeholders as well, right? Among financiers, I think that coordination, because you see, the challenge is that there are too many standards out there. Those things can be very confusing. If I were to be a stakeholder within a country that is probably mobilizing financing, say green financing externally, and I have to consider 3 different standards that are probably not speaking to each other, it can be very confusing. So if I'm dealing with IFC, maybe the standard is different. If I'm dealing with ISDB, the standard is different. If I'm dealing with an institutional investor, the standard is different. So there has to be some level of harmonization of the standard that is actually being used. Of course, I know ICMA has played a very key role in helping to ensure that there is that harmonization when it comes to standard that is used in the bond market, in the capital market, and things like that. But I think there are a whole lot of much more that is still needed to be done when it comes to issues around standardization. So, regulatory policy, that's very clear. The what's it called, the standards and things like that. But the last part is around capacity. I think capacity is something that we would continue to have issues around capacity, as colleagues have rightly mentioned, capacity within private institutions, because the bulk of the monies that we need for the transition that we need are not going to come from the public sector. Development banks like us are not going to provide the huge trillions that we need. We are just going to provide monies that would help to basically the seed money that would help to de-risk certain sectors that people would typically, or private sector players would typically not want to go into. But the bulk of the money is going to come from the private sector, right? So then capacity is needed. As colleagues have mentioned, capacity to understand what do we mean by green? What falls into that categorization of what is green? It's possible you're already doing things that are related as green, but you do not know that they are green, right? So that is really, really needed. Capacity that actually fits into the reward system that we have currently. It doesn't support it, doesn't incentivize a lot of green investment. So ability to be able to bring all these things together, capacity, incentive system, regulatory system, I think they will play a very key role in helping us actualize that goal that we want to achieve. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Is there anyone else?
Hi, Safina, just to add a couple of points. Not along what needs to be done, because that's quite evident, and maybe I will share some pointers, but just to harp on one thing. See, green finance, there has been so much discussion about green finance recently that banks feel we need to go green. We want to become a green bank. We want to become a first green bank of this country. So this sort of vision is very good. And we see it in many banks, and the bankers that I talk to all the time, they have this ambition that they want to become. So financing energy efficiency, renewable energy, that sort of thing, they find quite sexy. But when it comes to managing environmental and social risks, the compliance bit of it, that's not sexy at all. That's like, oh my God, banks cannot do this. This is too difficult. Why should we? Why are we burdened to do so much things? This will create a barrier for access to finance. We cannot, our clients won't comply. They don't want to give us any licenses, permits, etc. But if they don't do environmental risk assessment, climate risk assessment, and go ahead and does energy efficiency, green financing, it will just be termed as greenwashing. And when the country would be branded as a country where greenwashing is quite rampant, it would be very difficult to do green bonds. It would be very difficult to do any other thing, because the reputation of the country for such things are very important. And there is so much happening in the rest of the world where greenwashing has tarnished very, very reputable companies in getting into this space. So it's very important to tread very carefully that until and unless you have solidly committed to manage your environmental and social risks, and then you want to also do green finance, climate finance, that is absolutely okay. But until and unless you are committed to your money is actually going into polluting the rivers and cutting down of forests, and on the other hand, you're doing renewable energy financing and doing big mega projects of solar farms and wind farms and et cetera, this would absolutely be totally detrimental. So something for us to think about quite clearly.
Point very well made. Ms. Sabah, over to you.
Thank you, Safina. Yeah, I mean, I would definitely echo what Dr. Fifa and Mr. Yusuf have said. I mean, I think you mentioned that there's been 100 billion committed by the last count, I think, which was July 2020, 83.3 billion. It's 100 billion per year that developed countries have to give. I believe in the Macron summit recently, it was announced that they have actually met the 100 billion target. But obviously, when we look at what's needed. I mean, for example, I think it's 4 to 6 trillion per year is needed for the low carbon transformation. That money is there in private capital, which development financial capital can unlock. But it's also, I think the regulators do need to step up. Without mandating or without a lot of the sustainable finance taxonomies, some of the ESRM frameworks across the region, they're still voluntary. And without mandatory sort of pushes towards banks adopting net zero pledges, which means that anything that they finance in the real economy also needs to be around net zero. And therefore, such regulation importantly creates a level playing field, because otherwise what you get is a bank saying, why should I lose business by imposing all these standards on my corporate client when he can go down the road and get that financing cheaper and not have to comply? So that level playing field is really important. And without that, I think, we're not going to see a step forward. And I certainly hope in 2030 that happens. And I guess the final point is, when ESCAP tracks all the progress of the SDGs, and what we find for our region is that all of the SDGs are not where they need to be. And goal 13, which is on climate action, has actually regressed. So not only is it not where it needs to be 7 years before 2030, we've gone backward. So that already points to the fact that, yes, so many more investments in green finance is happening, and yet the picture is not, really working out. So yeah, that needs to change.
Thank you for sharing this very useful information. And I would like to take a few questions from the audience as well here. So there's one question for Mr. Yusuf and Dr. Rafifa. So are there any smaller ticket size projects or funding options available for the private sector in developing countries such as ours?
I'm just going to give from the perspective of the bank. The direct answer to the question is yes, there are, but depending on the way you look at it, right? So there are different funds that the bank actually has, that some are actually channeled through financial intermediaries, right? So which are basically earmarked for certain types of activities, right? There are some that we actually managed. So we serve as a manager for some external resources, like some from dedicated climate, where we actually provide to our member countries. So it's all dependent on the sort of activities that we're talking about here. But if you're looking at clear-cut private sector-led financing, of course, we do have the private sector arm of the bank, which is similar to IFC, which we call the ICD. So they do directly with private companies, but then they do have a certain level of threshold that is required for them to be able to actually, whether it's through equity, whether it's through line of credit. So they do have those different modalities and instruments and windows that they have when it comes to providing financing to support a private. Multilateral development banks are big, and they do have different instruments and windows. So depending on what exactly is needed, you can easily find something that is related. From the public side, of course, it would have to go directly through the government, through the what's it called, the government. That's if it's sovereign investment. But if it's private, then it's they do have their own what's it called, requirement as well, that may be needed depending on the nature of our activity. But I do understand that there's usually a minimum threshold that is required for such business, for them to actually get engaged in certain level of businesses. But if you're looking at things around grant element, of course, the grant element are always very limited. I know most times when people talk about, oh, okay, development bank providing finance, it's always the grants that is actually so from the perspective of the bank, there are grants that we do have, but they are very limited. But those are usually targeted towards, say, youth innovative activities, say maybe youth entrepreneurship, like we did at COP27 last year, where we had young people pitching ideas of their businesses, and then they got certain level of grants on the basis of that, right? So, but those are not like a long-term program. These are like dedicated programs that is geared towards certain type of activities. So those options, those opportunities are there, but they can be very limited if we're looking at them from the perspective of grant-based support.
Yeah, please,
if
Dr.
I-
Shifa.
Yeah, so if I can just add to what Mr. Yusuf said, is that small ticket investments would be a bit difficult from IFC's perspective because there are certain thresholds. But of course, for SME clients, we do have targeted loans through financial institutions, which the SMEs can avail. Also, small ticket microfinance institutions involved in green projects can also avail these loans through the financial institutions where we have invested and have targeted loans towards this sort of thing. That was one question. The other one was how to attract private sector, how they can know about green finance. So one way of doing it is banks do it all the time. They're very good at doing it. They have a separate marketing department for doing this sort of things. So if they want to promote women entrepreneurs, they would launch a product, have hoardings, billboards, they promote their product. They have relationship managers who would go out and promote this product. They have all sorts of ways of doing it. So that is not very difficult, but the difficult bit is banks taking a stand that yes, this is a product that we are going to work on. This is something we are going to do seriously. This is a portfolio where we are going to build this portfolio. And another thing that works is regulatory push. So for example, in Bangladesh, Central Bank has made it mandatory that 5% of any bank's portfolio has to be in green finance. They have their taxonomy. They have given a list of 67 things. Banks will have to claim that within those 67 things, they have 5% of their portfolio. So this sort of regulatory push actually makes a bit of difference. The other thing that has happened is incentivizing green finance. So Central Bank has refinancing scheme where the ultimate subsidy goes to the end users. But the bank in the middle that provides these loans in green finance, their spread doesn't decrease. So banks get their profit, but the end user gets interest subsidy. These sort of innovative offerings from the regulators also can push green finance towards the right direction. The other last example that I want to share with you is in Bangladesh, where we don't have, I mean, not in Bangladesh only, but in the rest of the world, IFC doesn't have any grant. But in Bangladesh, we partnered with USAID. They had grant for energy efficiency and cleaner production. The way we worked this out is we worked with banks in providing green finance, and the grant component of USAID was used as a deal sweetener, which wooed private sector to come and avail these green finance loans from the banks that IFC has invested in. So this is an example where grant money all over the world is very difficult to come by. But if there are small pots or elements to initiate or kickstart the green finance or climate finance initiative, I think that there are many creative ways this can be done, and there are many examples also where it has been done very nicely. The second
thank you
was around training. Do you want me to take that now or later?
I think we can take it later.
Sure.
Okay, so thank you for sharing this. And, as we've gathered so far, that there are multiple stakeholders which are involved in the process of green financing. So there are regulators, there's government, there's academia, there's a lot of, stakeholders which are involved. So as we know, and we know that policies, serve as essential frameworks for creating and enabling environments that incentivizes private sector and other stakeholders to sort of invest in green and going in adopting the green processes. With this in mind, my question again is for all the panelists that based on your expertise and experience, what policies would you recommend to the key stakeholders, including governments, development organizations, private sector, and so on and so forth, to enhance the effectiveness of green financing? Anyone who would like to take the floor for this?
I can start, and I'm sure, I think firstly, from our perspective, we are obviously, the United Nations sort of secretariat, and I'm sure our colleagues from banks will. There's a lot of controversy over many different roles of what banks should be doing, what regulators should be, and this is a healthy debate. I think because of the complexity of what's required, one thing that we have seen has been quite successful as a single unifying action is a net zero pledge. So, for example, if a bank, for example, Mitsubishi Group, I think they have $3.3 trillion in assets. They've adopted a net zero pledge to go net zero emissions by 2050 with actions until from 2030 onwards. And they're in the process now of talking to their corporate clients. And that will necessarily mean that at some point they will look at how they can continue or discontinue financing fossil fuels. So if more banks were to adopt such net zero pledges, which countries have obviously already adopted in the NDCs, so it is a natural cascading down. That could be, a big action.
Thank you.
Hi, Safina, if I
Mr.
can
Singh.
add.
Yes.
One of the things that we have done in the past is we have developed a monitoring and evaluation tool for central banks to keep track on banks on how they perform in the sustainability space. Now, what it does is in the central bank's radar screen, they have a rating for all banks. So say top 5 sustainable banks, lower 5 sustainable banks. So the top 5 sustainable banks, these banks are mentioned in the annual report of the central bank as sustainable banks. And the lower 5, they would require, they would be mentored by central bank and hand holding and have discussions why you're struggling, what are the challenges. And in my experience, none of the banks wants to be in that position. So this has been working pretty well. The other thing that is very important, and I feel that central banks can be benefited by this exercise, is trying to look beyond the horizon to understand what's coming instead of acting once it is there. So for example, there are new policies coming up, new requirements coming up. We are asking banks to do environmental and social due diligence, but coming up in the horizon is climate risk assessment, which will be much more rigorous, much more technical, much more difficult, much more complicated, much more elaborate. And if banks cannot do normal, simple environmental and social due diligence, it will be very difficult for them to do climate risk assessment for the project. So central banks also in similar essence needs to understand what's coming their way. And that is why we have something called a roadmap exercise, which we have developed for all central banks. And they can go through this roadmap exercise, whereby year by year, they will have a roadmap whereby they will look beyond the horizon and come up with a plan when they are going to do what. And if they publish it, it is also easier for banks to understand that what's coming their way. Because if all of a sudden central bank comes and says, oh, from tomorrow you'll have to report on climate figures, it will be very difficult for them. They won't be able to do it. And central bank would also not want to put banks in such a situation. So this roadmap exercise is beneficial for banks and also for central banks. And we have an organization called SBFN, Sustainable Banking and Finance Network, which is a network for regulators. And this initiative, the roadmap initiative and the diagnostic tools are part of this SBFN's activity. They have another activity which is quite interesting and I found quite useful, is they have a ranking system for all central banks. So if you're a central bank and you're working on sustainability, then you'd be ranked as per the performance of other central banks. So for example, Bangladesh is in advanced stage, or the central bank is in advanced stage. There are certain parameters and they fulfill those parameters, whereas Pakistan is just in developing stage. So that they know that there are certain things they will have to do if they want to go to the advanced stage. So this measurement report are also available in the public domain, and you can see which country's central bank is working more rigorously in sustainability space. I'll stop here and happy to take more questions.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your insights and recommendations. And I believe this also, Mr. Yusuf, would you like to add something to this?
Yeah. So, so I think just to sum up the point that Mrs. Yusufa and Dr. FIFA actually mentioned is the fact that I think to sum this whole thing up is for every regulator, I think one key thing that is crucial is the ease of doing business must be the priority, right? The more we have businesses that are focused on green investment, the more they're going to have the demand for green financing. So it's basically, it's possible that you have a lot of green financing, but then you don't have a lot of businesses that are really ready to be able to tap into those financing. But then the more you have green focused businesses, then you're going to find a whole lot of demand for green financing from those businesses. And then the financial providers would then start having products to fit into some of those. It's basically the law of demand and supply. The more demand that is coming from those green focused businesses. So in the end, the key thing that is crucial to, if I'm to advise any government today, is that you need to make the ease of doing business very easy, like the way businesses are done in that in any country, particularly for green focused businesses. I think it has to be as easy as possible, whether it's an issue of getting their registration, getting their procurement, everything that is needed within the context of the government itself. I think it's once that is done, I think it can make a whole lot of things much easier. The other thing is around issues of subsidy. I think government would have to prioritize what they subsidize and where they put the subsidies that they provide. Like I said earlier, if you subsidize activities that are get towards green investment, then you're going to find more investment in that particular sector by virtue of the fact that there's a lot of incentive that is actually provided. We've seen in countries where for those that are actually investing in, say, renewables, where there is this what's it called, purchase agreements between, say, the government and these energy providers. We've seen how they've been able to play a very key role in helping to drive more investment into those sectors, because it's a way of guaranteeing to say there's a power purchase agreement between the government and those energy providers that are providing energy through clean sources. Those are policies that are helping to incentivize those things. So in the end, it has to be the ease of doing green business, not just the ease of doing business. The ease of doing green business in a country must be improved. If that is improved, then there's a likelihood that there's going to be high demand for green financing, which would come from the financial sector. So that's for me a policy direction that can really help to increase green financing in any country, basically. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing these recommendations. And with this, I will take one last question from the audience. So are there any, and this is to all three panelists, that are there any trainings available right now at this point in time to the banks which they can access for the development of their green products or to transition to green? Are there any ready-made trainings available online that these banks can easily access?
We have a website called the First for Sustainability. And this is a web page that has been developed exclusively for bankers. And there are some inbuilt trainings there which the banks can access. In their own time, it's free for all bankers. So that's one. And there are a lot of information, tools, checklists that banks can also use. So resource material is there. It's quite a rich website. First for Sustainability. We also have country level training programs that we organize on a regular basis for bankers. So banks can attend the last rounds of training that we did in Islamabad, Lahore, and Karachi was done jointly with NIBAF. So NIBAF will continue doing more green finance related training. NIBAF is the training arm of the central bank. We also organize training for consultants. to build local capacity in the market related to green finance. We have conducted two, one in Karachi and one in Lahore. So consultant training has also happened from time to time.
Thank you. Mr. Yusuf, the floor is yours.
So yes, just similar to colleagues from IFC. So there are numerous training options out there. In fact, one easy way to also get some of those trainings, particularly if you go to UNCCLEN portal, they have a whole lot of training modules that are related to climate. So for instance, if you want to learn about the capital market, carbon market, green financing, those modules are there, and they can be very, very useful for any level of participant. So in terms of the customized training, so we do have customized training that are specifically for the investment that we do. For instance, if we're providing financing to a government, and then there are trainings that are needed, or we're providing financing to a group of private sector players, and then there is training that is actually needed. But also, there are also new training modules that we're developing with our colleagues from SIBAFI, particularly on things around GHG accounting, for Islamic finance institutions. So those trainings they happen from time to time. So I think it would be good to check the website of many of these institutions, like SIBAFI and the other organizations that we actually work with. And we'll get updates from time to time. But I can bet that there are just tons of trainings in this era of climate action, driving green economic growth. You find a whole lot of training that are out there, specifically focused for different class of persons.
Thank you for sharing these initiatives, and I hope our audience will benefit from these. As we near the end of our session on green financing, I would like to thank our speakers, Ms. Subha, Dr. Afifa, and Mr. Yusuf, for sharing your valuable insights, and your expertise indeed has provided us with a deeper understanding of the role, challenges, opportunities, and policy recommendations associated with green financing in driving sustainable development. And we hope to see continued collaboration in the future. Together, we can strive towards a greener and more sustainable world. With that, we conclude today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful day ahead.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Safina.
Bye.
Thanks, participants, for joining. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.